My name is Joaquim, and I want to share with you the most terrifying experience of my life. It happened on my farm, the place I inherited from my father and always considered my refuge. I never believed in superstitions, but what I experienced there changed my perspective forever. It all started on an ordinary night. I woke up to a strange noise coming from the cornfield. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and went to see what was happening. I thought it was some animal invading my crops. When I got there, I saw that the scarecrow was not in its place. It always stood in the middle of the cornfield, but that night its spot was empty. I looked around but found nothing. I went back home, trying to convince myself that maybe the wind had knocked the scarecrow over. However, the feeling of being watched never left me. In the following days, things started to get even stranger. The animals were agitated, the crops began to rot, and I found mysterious footprints around the house. One night, I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps downstairs. I grabbed my rifle and slowly descended the stairs. When I reached the living room, I saw something that chilled my blood. The scarecrow was standing at the door, as if it had been waiting for me. Its glass eyes glowed in the darkness, and a sinister smile seemed to form on its face. Terrified, I ran to lock all the doors and windows, but before I could finish, I heard a chilling whisper coming from the bedroom. "You can't escape me." Trembling with fear, I entered the bedroom and saw the scarecrow sitting on my bed. At that moment, I realized I was dealing with something beyond my understanding. The next morning, I went to town and sought out the priest. I told him everything and begged for help. He agreed to come to the farm and perform an exorcism. When we arrived, the scarecrow was back in its place in the cornfield, as if nothing had happened. The priest began to pray, and the atmosphere around us became heavy and suffocating. Suddenly, the scarecrow started to move, and a horrible voice echoed through the field. "You will never be safe." The priest continued to pray, but he was knocked down by an invisible force. I tried to help him, but I felt cold hands grabbing me and pulling me to the ground. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was the scarecrow advancing toward me. When I woke up, I was alone in the cornfield. The priest was dead, and the scarecrow, now covered in blood, was back in its place. I fled from there as fast as I could. I abandoned the farm and never went back. Today, the farm is abandoned, and the few who dare to approach it say they hear sinister laughter and see the scarecrow moving at night. I know that I can never escape what I faced, and I pray that no one else will go through the same terror I did. This is my story, and I share it with you as a warning. There are things in this world that we cannot explain and from which we cannot escape. Be careful with what you encounter in the dark, for it may not be just your imagination. My name is Mariana, and I need to tell you about the most horrifying experience I've ever endured. My husband Lucas and I had always dreamed of starting a new life in the countryside, away from the chaos of the city. So, when we found an old farm for sale, we thought it was the perfect place. The house was beautiful, despite its age, but the locals avoided it and whispered about a tragedy that had occurred there decades ago. Determined to ignore the superstitions, we moved in and began our new life. At first, everything seemed fine. We were happy and busy with our new life, but soon strange things began happening. It started with small, almost imperceptible occurrences. Doors creaked open on their own, and at night we heard faint whispers as if someone were standing just out of sight, murmuring in the darkness. We tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the house settling, or perhaps our imaginations running wild in the new environment. One particularly eerie night, Lucas was away in town, and I was alone. The wind was howling outside, making the old house groan and creak. I was sitting on the couch trying to watch television when I heard a sharp scream coming from the barn. The sound was so intense and desperate that it made me jump up from the couch. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, expecting to find a trapped animal or something similar. However, when I arrived, everything was eerily silent. There were no signs of life. The barn was empty except for bloody handprints on the walls. Desperate, I went back inside and tried to call Lucas, but the line was dead. Fear began to consume me. That night, the feeling of being watched grew even stronger. I could sense a strange, cold presence in the house. As the days passed, things worsened. The screams continued to echo from the barn, and neighbors began to notice strange changes in my appearance. I looked pale and exhausted, with deep circles under my eyes. One morning, while Lucas was out buying supplies, I found an old diary hidden in a drawer. The diary belonged to a woman named Clara, who had lived on the farm before us. The pages were stained with blood and filled with horrific descriptions of how she and her family had been murdered by an envious neighbor. Clara had written about the spirits trapped on the farm, pleading for justice. The last entry in the diary was a desperate plea for someone to help her find peace. I began to investigate the farm's history and discovered that many years ago, an entire family had been murdered there. The pain and suffering of the victims had left an indelible mark on the place. Determined to help the spirits find peace, I decided to perform a cleansing ritual. I bought all the necessary items and prepared the space according to the diary's instructions. When night came, Lucas was home and helped me prepare the ritual. We lit candles and recited prayers, but the atmosphere in the house became even more oppressive. Suddenly, the wind started to blow fiercely, extinguishing the candles and causing the furniture to move on its own. Doors slammed open and shut, and I heard a sinister laughter coming from the barn. Lucas tried to calm me, but it was clear that something was terribly wrong. In a moment of desperation, I saw Clara's figure appear in front of us with an expression of sadness and rage. She began to scream, and the sound was so loud and painful that I felt like my head would explode. Lucas tried to help, but he was knocked down by an invisible force. Alone, I tried to complete the ritual, but Clara's figure seemed to become even more enraged. Finally, something within me awakened a strength I didn't know I had. I focused all my energy on the final prayer, and with one last scream, the shadows began to dissipate. Clara vanished, and a profound silence followed. Lucas and I, exhausted and terrified, managed to finish the ritual. The next morning, neighbors reported seeing a bright light emanating from the farm and said the screams had ceased. The farm seemed to have regained some of its peace, but what we lived through there will never be forgotten. We decided to sell the property as quickly as possible and moved away, but the feeling of being watched never fully left me. Today, the new owners of the farm say they still hear the wailing of the lost souls, pleading for justice, and I pray that no one else will have to endure the terror that Lucas and I went through. This is my story, and I share it with you as a warning. There are forces in this world that are beyond our understanding, and sometimes the past cannot be left behind. My name is Eduardo, and what I'm about to tell you is something that changed my life forever. I've always enjoyed mystery and horror stories, but I never imagined I'd end up living one. A few years ago, I bought an old abandoned farm that was put up for sale at a price far below market value. The property was in a remote area surrounded by a dense, shadowy forest. The idea of restoring the farm seemed like an exciting challenge, and I was eager to get started. From the beginning, the farm had a strange atmosphere. The first night I spent there, I was woken by a strange noise coming from upstairs. I thought it might just be the house settling, so I tried to ignore it. But the noises continued, and they seemed to come from a room that had been locked since I bought the property. I decided to investigate. When I finally managed to force open the door, I found the room covered in dust and cobwebs. But what scared me the most were the strange drawings on the walls, grotesque figures and symbols I couldn't identify. In the following days, the atmosphere on the farm grew even more oppressive. At night, I heard indistinct whispers and footsteps that seemed to echo through the walls. I decided to look into the property's history and discovered something terrifying. The farm had a macabre history. Decades ago, an entire family had vanished without a trace. Local residents spoke of curses and supernatural events, but I was determined to uncover the truth. One night, while trying to sleep, I was awakened by an intense cold and a sharp scream coming from the basement. Trembling, I descended the stairs with a flashlight in hand. The air was icy and heavy, and the flashlight shook in my grip. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw a ghostly, pale figure of a woman lying on the floor, with hollow eyes and an expression of terror. I tried to approach, but the figure vanished in a cloud of black smoke. The next morning, I found an old letter hidden among the beams in the basement. The letter was written in an elegant but shaky handwriting. In it, a desperate woman described her struggle to protect her family from malevolent forces that had invaded the farm. She spoke of dark rituals and a terrifying presence that had forced her to seal something deep in the basement before disappearing. The letter ended with a warning: never break the seal. I decided to investigate the basement further and found an old wooden box hidden under the floorboards. Inside the box were a series of strange objects, amulets, candles, and a small demon statue. I also found a book of witchcraft, its pages stained and worn. The last page had a mark that matched the symbol I had seen on the walls of the locked room. That night, as I was examining the book, the atmosphere in the farm changed drastically. The wind howled violently, and the windows slammed shut. I heard the sharp scream from the basement again, now accompanied by a deep, anguished wail. I rushed to the basement, but the woman's figure was no longer there. Instead, I found the book of witchcraft in flames, though there was no apparent explanation for how it had caught fire. Desperate, I decided to perform a purification ritual to try to end the malevolent presence haunting the farm. I followed the book's instructions, lighting candles and reciting the words aloud. However, as the ritual progressed, the environment grew increasingly oppressive. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the room was enveloped in a thick fog. I heard demonic laughter and horrible whispers, and the feeling of dread was almost unbearable. Finally, as I recited the last word of the ritual, everything fell silent. The fog disappeared, and I felt completely exhausted. However, I knew the farm was no longer a safe place. I decided I would not stay there any longer. Before leaving, I took one last look at the wooden box and found a message written on the sides. The curse does not fade, it only transfers. Today, the farm is abandoned once again. When I passed by the area recently, I saw new owners had moved in. I hope they have the wisdom to heed the signs and stay safe. The experience I went through was one of the most terrifying of my life and left me with a certainty. There are forces in the darkness that we cannot understand and that may be waiting to manifest when we least expect it. This is my story, and a warning for those who seek to uncover the unknown. Sometimes, what is buried in the past should remain there. My name is Laura, and what I'm about to share is something that haunts me to this day. A year ago, my husband Felipe and I decided to buy a property in the countryside, seeking an escape from the hustle and bustle of urban life. The house was an old rural estate with architecture dating back to the early 20th century, and it was located in a remote area surrounded by dense forest. The price was well below market value, which only piqued our curiosity. The idea of restoring the house and turning it into a home was tempting, but what we found was far beyond anything we could have imagined. From the first day, the house seemed like a dream, with large windows overlooking the lush green fields and a wild garden that, though in need of care, had a rustic charm. However, the basement of the house aroused our curiosity. It was a large, shadowy space with dusty bookshelves and disordered stacks of boxes. There was a strange feeling of unease whenever we ventured down there, but Felipe was excited about the possibility of finding antiques and possibly valuable items hidden among the old things. While exploring the basement, we found a diary hidden behind a bookshelf. The cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. The diary belonged to a man named Arthur, who had lived in the house decades earlier. As we flipped through the pages, we read about his growing paranoia and fear of something he called the abyss. Arthur described disturbing visions and nightmares that left him sleepless. He mentioned a point of entry in the basement where a dark force seemed to manifest. Arthur's description left us unsettled, but instead of backing away, we decided to investigate further. That night we heard strange noises coming from the basement, as if someone were moving among the boxes and shelves. Felipe tried to reassure me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Whatever was down there seemed to be preparing for something. The next morning we decided to explore the small door at the end of the library, which appeared to lead to a hidden space. We forced open the door and descended a steep staircase, entering a narrow and dark tunnel. The air was cold and damp, and there was a strong smell of mold and decay. As we moved forward, the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, as if we were entering a different world. Suddenly we heard a deep vibrating sound, as if something were moving in the shadows. The ground began to tremble, and a deafening roar filled the tunnel. Panic overtook us, and we tried to return, but the staircase had vanished. The tunnel was twisting and distorting, as if it were alive. Dark, distorted figures started appearing on the walls, their faces distant and full of malice. Felipe and I tried to find a way out, but everything seemed like an illusion, an endless maze. The figures on the walls seemed to move, watching us with penetrating stares. With each step, the environment grew more oppressive. The sound of the figures approaching became almost unbearable, and the feeling of being watched made us feel as if we were being hunted. Finally, we found a small opening that led us to a different space. What we saw upon emerging was even more terrifying. We were in a desolate and alien landscape, a scene of ruin and desolation. The sky was red and the air was heavy with a sense of death and desolation. The horizon was filled with crumbling buildings and shadowy figures wandering slowly. We realized that the tunnel had transported us to a parallel dimension, a place of terror and despair. We tried to return, but everything seemed out of place. tunnel had disappeared, and we were trapped in a world where reality seemed to unravel. With our hearts racing and our minds filled with panic, we managed to find a way back to our world. We found an exit and returned to the basement, but the experience left us traumatized. The feeling that something was following and watching us has never left. We decided to abandon the house and sell it, but the memory of what we saw and experienced in that dimension remains vivid. Today, the property is once again abandoned, and few dare to approach it. I often wonder if anyone else has had the courage to explore what lies beyond the abyss. The silence of the abyss is a constant reminder that there are forces beyond our understanding, and some doors, when opened, reveal horrors that should not be faced. This is my story and a warning for those who seek the unknown. Sometimes what is hidden in the depths should remain there. My name is Raphael, and what I'm about to share is a nightmare that I can never forget. My wife Anna and I have always had a taste for adventures and travels to unusual places. So when we found a remote cabin in the mountains, we decided it would be the perfect spot for a weekend retreat, away from the worries and stress of everyday life. The cabin was rustic, but had a peculiar charm, built of weathered wood and with a fireplace in the center of the room. It seemed like a cozy retreat. However, the cabin's basement caught our attention. The door was locked and covered in dust, which piqued our curiosity. After forcing it open, we discovered an old and dusty space filled with furniture covered in white sheets and dusty boxes. In the corner of the basement, we found a large box with a rusty padlock. Upon opening the box, we found a disturbing collection of old items, photographs of unknown people, a grotesque-looking doll, and a notebook covered in strange symbols. The notebook was filled with notes about rituals and occult practices. The author seemed obsessed with something called the Shadow Refuge, a place where he believed lost souls were kept and used for nefarious purposes. As we examined the notebook, night fell, and we decided it would be wise to leave the cabin as soon as possible. However, when we tried to exit, we found that the doors were locked from the inside, and the windows covered with a viscous black substance that seemed to pulsate. The feeling of being trapped was overwhelming. We tried to break a window, but something seemed to be preventing our progress. Fear completely took over. While searching for a way out, we began to hear whispers coming from the walls and the basement. The sensation of being watched was suffocating. Shadows began to materialize in the corners of the room, with indistinct forms slowly moving toward us. The doll we had found in the basement seemed to come to life, its eyes fixed on us with a malicious expression. The shadows began to close in, and panic set in. Desperate, we turned to the notebook and attempted to perform the ritual described to drive away the shadows. The instructions were complex and involved reciting words in an ancient language. As we recited, the shadows seemed to become enraged, growing denser and more aggressive. The notebook indicated that the ritual had to be performed with complete concentration, but the oppressive atmosphere made it nearly impossible. The shadowy figures became more aggressive and seemed to try to suffocate us. In the chaos, the grotesque doll began to move on its own, advancing toward us with a strange, awkward motion. The sensation of being attacked by something unseen was terrifying. The shadows were almost upon us when, with one last desperate scream, we managed to complete the ritual. The shadows retreated, and the doors unlocked. We escaped the cabin with pounding hearts and a lingering fear. The environment around us still seemed altered, with a sense that something was about to follow us. The cabin was left behind, and we never returned. The memories of that night remain vivid, and the feeling of being watched has never left me. The cabin, now abandoned, continues to be a place of mystery and terror. The Shadow Refuge is a constant reminder of what might lie hidden in the depths of the unknown. Sometimes what we seek as a refuge can turn into a nightmare beyond our comprehension. The experience left me with a lasting sense that some doors should never be opened and some shadows should never be confronted.